My question to you, Salvatore, before you get into what you thought of the Prime Minister's response is there a lesson here also for the Modi government and its fans? And is that lesson this? That you may not like this question about India's democratic record. You may not agree with it, but you cannot duck it. There is a narrative in large sections of the Western media, in several Western governments, and at home among many critics of the Modi government. And therefore, the approach thus far of the government to avoid this question, to not engage with it, to term those who pose it as anti national, this too is flawed because even at the most sort of glamorous ceremonial reception that you get in the most powerful country in the world, this question is going to follow you. So you need to start engaging with this question.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I think the Indian government, from the standpoint of its international image, has done very poorly in public diplomacy, has done very poorly in presenting this message, whether it's the prime minister making, a very general statement or Dr. Jaishankar making much more muscular statements. They've taken the line that has been adopted now by the United States government. They've taken the line that, it's wrong of you to criticize us. So we're not going to answer these criticisms. I think it would be much smarter for them, again, for public diplomacy purposes, to answer the criticisms. Instead, they seem to be playing for a domestic audience. And of course, they are politicians. So I understand why they would rather play to the domestic audience than try to give a specific rebuttal. But it's not very good for their public diplomacy efforts. I mean, look, the two questions asked by the Wall Street Journal reporter were about the human rights of Muslims and about freedom of speech in India. Now, on the human rights of Muslims, well, we have the data that 98% of Muslims in India say they're free to practice their religion. 98%. Now, Indians may not agree with that. Indians may think that's a false representation. Muslim leaders in India may say, no, that's false. I don't know what Indians may feel about that. That's the hard data. I mean, whether people like it or not, that's the hard data. From a top quality survey with a high response rate, with a large sample, that's the data. Now, why the Indian government doesn't respond with that, I don't know. I think it's a strategic mistake from the standpoint of public diplomacy. But that's really what we need to be talking about. Now, freedom of speech, it's hard to measure freedom of speech. As someone who watches the Indian media, at least the English language Indian media at length, I think there's extreme freedom of speech in India. But, that's a subjective judgment. But we can go to safety of journalists. Journalists are safer in India. And again, it's data from the Committee to Protect Journalists, which is, if anything, an anti-Indian government activist organization. More journalists are killed in the United States on a per capita basis than in India.
Let me give you, since you mentioned free speech, data collated by a digital database, Article 14, and I'm quoting them here. They say that of 405 Indians who face sedition cases, right, between 2010 to 2021 for criticizing politicians and governments, 96% of these were registered after 2014. That's, of course, the year that the Modi government came to power. This is also data. This is the NCRB data that you also see on your screen right now. So if we're talking data, we also have to contextualize that India's Law Commission recently actually upheld only in a recommendation, only as a recommendation, that the sedition law should stay, even though there's a wide cross-party consensus building up that this law needs to be scrapped. So all I'm arguing, Salvatore, is that the democracy debate is a complex one. Democracies are imperfect. The American democracy is imperfect. The Indian democracy is imperfect. There are things wrong, and we shouldn't be defensive about discussing the things that are wrong.
Of course they are, and I doubly agree with you that nobody should try to be defensive about it. And I think the real problem for India's narrative is that Dr. Jaishankar and, to a lesser extent, Mr. Modi have been defensive about it instead of going on the offensive, instead of presenting the facts. So on sedition, we see these, and this is something I've been talking about again for a year now. On sedition, there is no trend in either the filing of sedition cases or in prosecutions over time. Yet if you strategically choose specific endpoints, you can make it look like there's a trend. Now, if you go, say, from the year 2000 to today, and you ask about the annual filing of FIRs for sedition, you find there's no trend. Per year, there's the same frequency of filing of sedition before and after 2014. Now, that's not a narrative anyone ever gets out because no one goes to the data. They go to an activist report. So the activist looks at the data, produces a report, and then journalists cite the activist report. But the activist is, of course, trying to find a way they can take that raw data, which I guarantee you show no trend. I can go through the data with you sometime. I'd love to show it to you. But the data show no trend. That's regardless of the fact of whether the cases are being filed by BJP governments or non-BJP. We don't have that data easily accessible. But the trend just isn't there unless you strategically choose particular endpoints that you can make it look like a trend. That is, you find the last year under which there were a large number of cases filed under UPA, and you go 1 year past that, right? And so you strategically find endpoints. But there's simply no trend in the data. This is something they should get out. I mean, if I could explain how this works, let me go to the most important data that's hurled in the United States, that's hurled against the Indian government. This is from the annual report of the U.S. State Department's International Religious Freedom Report. Now, the International Religious Freedom Report has literally every year over 1,000 documentations of allegations of violence against Christians or crimes against Christians in India. Generally, there are fewer than 10 allegations of crimes against Muslims. Okay. Yet, when the narrative comes out from the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, they only cite that they give language along the lines of India faces, worsening problems of religious freedom. Muslims in India face discrimination. Now, that narrative that Muslims face discrimination, if you go back to the data, is actually based on more than 1,000 allegations of violations of Christians' rights. Yet, when the U.S. ambassador, appointed by Joe Biden, his ambassador at large for international religious freedom, gave his summary of the report, he only mentioned crimes against Muslims. Now, that narrative building is being driven by Muslim Americans, by international Islamist organizations, by activist organizations who feel they can weaponize the social exclusion of Muslims in India, who don't feel they can realistically weaponize the social exclusion of Christians. And so because they think they can get traction over it, they try to push that narrative. But when we go back to the data, it's just not there.
But no data, this way or that way, actually gives you texture. And when I talk about texture, I also think it's important for us to talk about rhetoric, hate mongering, hate speech, inflammatory speeches, the talk of Hindutva, the talk of being, everyone in India should actually self-identify as Hindu culturally. And when the RSS chief said that, he then went on to say that it's a geographical reference point I'm making, not a religious one. I'm just saying all of this is also in the public discourse. But let's pick up another data point. Another data point is what's happening with non-governmental organizations, many of which have lost their registration because of the FCRA license. That's the right to get foreign funds. Now, this is a big talking point in India. The critics of the government say it has been weaponized against critics. How do you see this? And then after this, I want to go back to America because we can have a longer debate about India's democracy another time. I want to go back to how you think the visit went, but let's pick this up as one talking point.
Sure. When I first entered Indian consciousness, let's say, last November, the very first thing that critics did was look up anything they could find on me, and they found I had made a United States foreign influence registration. And then I told them, when the reporter called me, I said, I also have one in Australia, because I follow the law. I'm required to make a registration. Now, I made this registration despite not even knowing, actually precisely because I didn't know the source of the funds that were paying me. I wasn't sure whether they were private funds or government funds. I have no idea. So I do a registration just to be safe. It's the right thing to do for $4,000, mind you. Tiny thing. It became national news in India, Salvatore Babones, foreign agent, because we follow the administrative requirements. Now, the FCRA, the only change that was made since 2014 was to add that the tax ID numbers, the national ID numbers of the officers of the charities have to register. Now, I have to register, and I'm just me, a professor getting $4,000.